Really pleased today to have Suzanne Weeks with us, who was recommended, I think, from Ben and John Southworth for her presentation on what your brain looks like on drugs and alcohol. So thank you very much for being here, Suzanne.
Thank you. And I'm hoping I can talk on this side a little bit.
Sure.
Okay. And I do have this really fun pointer. So yes, my name is Suzanne Weiss. I've been excited about coming today. This is a new group for me. I've talked to pharmacists, I've talked to nurses, physicians, and not ever lawyers. So, but I do have a few friends that are lawyers. So my specialty is the neuroscience of addiction, basically. I hope you can bear with me. I had pneumonia a couple weeks ago, and I still sound like I'm sick. I feel great, but my voice sounds crazy. So hopefully I can make it through this without getting too worse than this. So we'll see. So my background basically is I'm a registered nurse, and I graduated from nursing school decades ago. And so I've done a lot. My interest early on was head injury patients. I did a lot of trauma ICU and got a neuro certification. So that's what that little CNRN is, a certified registered nurse with a specialty in neuroscience. And so I've been studying the brain since the 80s, but mostly for injuries and illnesses, different neurological illnesses and things. But then, starting into the mid-90s, I ended up in recovery myself. So I started looking for everything that I could find on what does it mean if you're an alcoholic, let's just say addict and keep it simple. So what does that mean for the brain? And in the 90s were called the decade of the brain. I don't know if that rings a bell with you all, but George Bush the first was an alcoholic and pretty open about it, and so he did a lot of rallying for funding for the National Institute of Health to start investigating where alcoholism comes from on the biological side. So the data started erupting in the 90s about addiction and statistics and what impact it has on your brain and the brain chemistry. So luckily that's right when the internet was available to me, so I got to start my research really early. I'm now just finishing up a PhD at the Idaho State University, and my dissertation topic is on the neuroscience of addiction. So it's been a long haul, but so some of what I want to talk about does relate to me on a personal note because I've been in recovery for many years. I come from a family of alcoholics, which I don't know that we ever called them that. We just said dysfunctional families. And statistically, there's always a lot of questions about the statistics of alcoholism because, for starters, most people don't want to say they are an alcoholic. Yeah, me too. I'll meet you at the bar. So it's usually not a lot of open, even asking people how much they drink. I've tried many times to do my own surveys, and it's really difficult. And then, of course, the street drug part. So, you ever tried just a scotch of heroin? No? It's like nothing. And so it's really tough to get the real numbers. But addiction in the nursing profession, I have found articles anywhere from 5% to 55% of nurses have an addiction problem. So my theory on that is I believe that certain professions call out to the helping professions or the hero professions call out to people who've been raised in dysfunctional families where it's been quite easy to take on the hero, rescuer, nurturer role, and then you just very naturally can step into a caregiver role. So I still don't have good numbers on, real accurate numbers on nurses, and I don't think we'll get that until we do blood work on everybody and take a good look at their DNA. So, but I do believe it's a higher than average population. And I think part of that is the caregiver role that a lot of dysfunctional family members have. It's kind of natural to go become a nurse. So to get into the science of this, I'm not going to go real deep, I promise. But I do want you to understand what happens and what you're dealing with clients who are addicted. So in our world, we call it substance use disorder, which I'm not a fan of that term. And I want to talk briefly about the pathophysiology and then more about how we can treat this issue and what happens to the brain when you've been using. So there's lots of names for addicted patients in our world, and probably yours too. Of course, substance use disorder is the kindest, which we hardly ever use. And then the alcoholics, addicts, junkie, pothead, stoners, frequent flyers, that's a good one, manipulators, and then the bottom one, which is my personal favorite, reward deficiency syndrome. And that's a newer phrase that was brought about by a scientist named Kenneth Blum at the University of Texas, Austin, back in the 90s. He's the guy that discovered the whole dopamine connection to alcoholism. And so reward deficiency syndrome, if you think about that concept, if you're missing some neurochemistry that's going to make you feel good, if somebody tells you no more drinking, because that works for a while, there's a lot of other choices, right? I mean, there's excessive exercise, there's going out and dancing on stage, which you guys do, right? They're performing. And there's sex addictions or pornography addictions, gambling addictions. So if you're trying to satisfy an area of your brain that is deficient in rewarding chemicals, just because you put one batch of things aside doesn't mean that you don't have to deal with other addictions that come up, shopping, spending. There's just a whole lot of choices. So, which is one of the reasons why people, once they get into recovery, they stay in recovery, or if we're lucky, stay in recovery for many years, because these little things like balls in the pool, they pop up and like, oh my God, I can't stop eating the donuts, you know. Now I'm 300 pounds. Yeah, that's what you get when you're 5 years sober. Keep coming back, and then it'll be, you know, gambling. So we work together on this reward deficiency syndrome, and there are ways of helping your brain with that. So see if I can get this going. There. So have you guys seen the commercial where the guy's dressed up in a scrub outfit and a stethoscope, and I think he's trying to be a nurse, but maybe a doctor, and he's got dark hair, and he's, addiction is a disease. And then it's some kind of treatment place like overseas. Have you seen that? The way he says it, I just think, oh, you're just making it worse, man, because we want to know why it's a disease and not some kind of a choice, like just stop. Why don't you just stop and life will get better? So the definition of a disease is something I wanted to go over just briefly. It's a condition of the body or one of its parts that impairs normal function and is typically manifested with distinguishing signs and symptoms. So it's kind of predictable, progressive, and usually incurable. Oh, there it is. I said it. So it can be fatal if not arrested. So other disease processes that we now as a culture have embraced are diseases like diabetes, cancer, cardiac disease. We know that these are things that you are kind of going to have once you've got the diagnosis, but you can kind of keep it at bay. It doesn't get too crazy if you do what you're supposed to do to take care of your body. So what makes us, you, me, more vulnerable to being an addict? Genetics, cultural influences, everybody's going out for a beer after work, environmental influences, stress, trauma, diet, medications, and age of first use. So I put those up there because it's usually a combination, just like it is for a lot of other diseases. For example, if you end up with cardiac disease and you have a heart attack and you say, well, what happened, doc? Well, what happened was you were born in a family where the genetic predisposition for a bad heart was there. Your grandfather and your dad, all, you know, they died at 50 from a heart attack or whatever. Can't change that. Our diet and our environment gives you that cardiac problem. Stress and trauma is what I call a chemical burn. So if you're under a lot of stress, you're chewing up a lot of dopamine. Dopamine is the boss of all the feel-good chemicals. So if you're under stress or you've been in a traumatic event, PTSD, even if it's like a sunburn that's really bad, your body responds by excreting dopamine to tell all the other feel-good chemicals what to do in this situation. Okay. So how much of a risk is genetic? That's one I like to ask. You know, there's a test now that BRBA, which is a blood test to see if you have a higher risk for breast cancer. Right, so like I think it was Angelina Jolie or one of those guys. They got it done, and she had like an 80% chance of getting breast cancer. Didn't mean she had it, but her mom had it, her aunts had it. So what's she going to do? Well, they went ahead and did a mastectomy because her risk was over 80% of getting breast cancer. With addiction, The predisposition with these genetic compounds is a 77% chance of becoming addicted, which is extremely high from my perspective. And what that means is a combination of things. I put down the little breast cancer thing here. But I wanted to put this picture up here of the genetic compounds. It's not one gene, it's not one DNA strand. It's, my analogy for this is it's kind of like having all the ingredients for a cake. So I put all those ingredients on my countertop. It does not mean I have a cake. It means I have all the ingredients that I need for a cake. So if you have all those genetic markers, and that comes from one or both parents, and the statistics go quite high if both parents drink alcohol to excess. It's just like the cake. If you start drinking alcohol, especially at a really young age, a lot of people in recovery will report they started drinking when they were 12. That's not unusual. Went out behind the barn, started smoking at 14 and that sort of thing. If you have that genetic predisposition, it's like putting that cake in the bowl and starting to mix. Now, at what point does it actually turn into a disease process? It depends on how young you are when you started, how extreme your brain chemistry is, and your liver enzymes. So it really depends on your body makeup as to how sick you can get, how fast. Some people are hitting rock bottom by the time they're 18. You know, I met a kid who was celebrating 30 days clean from heroin, and he was 10. His family all used heroin. They shot heroin. So at 10 years old, he came to 12-step meetings because he was addicted. So it just depends a lot on your family, how extreme your family is, how sick they are, what your risk is. Oh, Lady Gaga. I know. So, you know, the song, I Was Born That Way. Well, all of those genetic markers, you're born with that. You can't do anything about that. It's non-modifiable risk factor there. Sorry, you come from a family of addicts. But what that gives you is your brain does not produce as much dopamine as you need. So you kind of got your wimpy in the dopamine department. And as I said, that is the boss of all the feel-good chemicals like serotonin and epinephrine, norepinephrine, all of those, acetylcholine, and all of those wake up, do something exciting things. They're kind of all dependent on this dopamine to boss them around. Low serotonin levels, both of these can be measured in the blood now. Abnormal liver enzymes. And those there's a lot of complex abnormal liver enzymes. So, but basically what this is saying is that if you have that genetic compound, you may not have enough of the right enzymes to break down alcohol in a way that doesn't give this byproduct that's so toxic it starts killing your liver. So that is also in addition to dopamine levels. Then you've got this liver that really should never have an alcoholic beverage in it. It just produces all these formaldehyde type things. So, what else? So some of the genetic variants are what's impacting the way the liver is. So if you had a dead alcoholic on the autopsy table and you sliced and diced his liver, the enzymes in that liver would be quite a bit different than the enzymes in a normal person's liver. According to the National Institute of Health, now this was in 2015, we have about a 16% addiction rate in our country, which, like I said, assessing addiction is really hard to do because there's not sometimes a whole lot of honesty going on with it. So these numbers also change even with the National Institute of Health. 16 to 20% is what I would say. Now, I better keep an eye on the time because you guys think you're getting out of here early. Yeah, so I just wanted to say real briefly, went back in the 90s after I had been diagnosed with alcoholism, which of course totally surprised me. I thought, oh no, you must be confused. I am not an alcoholic. I mean, my family is. But so as I got into my recovery process, a couple years into it, I started my own little survey because I wanted to know what's the norm, what's statistics. I'd read this book that said 16% of the population drinks more than 4 to 6 times a year, and they don't drink more than 2 drinks in one sitting. And I thought, well, that's not true. Everybody drinks more than 2 drinks in one sitting, and certainly not 3 or 4 times a year, because in my world, that's a weekend, right? So I was working in a same-day surgery center up in Washington State, and we have these, we evaluate patients as they come in and, you know, for education before they have their operation. And one of our questions on the questionnaire was, do you drink alcohol or use recreational drugs? So I volunteered to do this task Eventually, over 18 months, I saw 2,000 people. So I did my own study, which would have been totally trashed by my dissertation committee if they saw what I did. But in general, what I found over 18 months was I would ask them, do you drink alcohol or use recreational drugs? And about 80% of them said, well, I drink alcohol. I used to smoke a little pot. I think that was about it, yeah. So I didn't really care. I just want to know about the alcohol. So if they say, yeah, I do drink alcohol, about 80% said that. And the next question was, how often do you drink? Daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly? And believe it or not, about 80% of them said 3 or 4 times a year. I was like, what? That can't be right. And oh yeah, you know, like New Year's Eve, Christmas Day, maybe a wedding in the summer, I'll have some, I mean, they could actually tell me when they drank. And this was 80% of the people that I asked, 2,000 people. So this was blowing my idea of what, you know, no wonder I was in denial. I had no idea that what I was doing wasn't normal. So the how many drinks in one sitting was, do you drink more than 2 drinks in one sitting? And the majority of the people said no. So I have 1 drink, like at a party, and I'll drink maybe half of the other one and just kind of carry it around with me. And I'm like, oh, you're that person. You're the one that leaves all the good stuff behind. Like you go on a cruise and you've left all your booze. Are you kidding? Yeah, that was not me. So anyway, I got that statistic. About 20% said they drank more than 2 to 4 or 3 to 4 times, 4 to 6 times a year, sorry. So I came up with an analogy for that, which is my pumpkin pie analogy. If you asked me how often I eat pumpkin pie, I would say 3 or 4 times a year. Do you ever eat more than 2 pieces? No, I mean, maybe a 3rd piece if I'm being a pig, but usually it's 2 pieces max, right? So, and I have that on Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's maybe, or some other time during the year where I see pumpkin pie on a menu at Denny's or something. So if a physician told me, Suzanne, this pumpkin pie is going to kill you. You need to stop eating it. I would never have another piece of pumpkin pie. But when they said this alcohol is killing you, you have to stop drinking it, I freaked out. I was like, are you kidding? But I don't have a problem with alcohol. Yeah, maybe the pain pills and that stuff was a little much of the pot. But no, I don't have a problem with alcohol. Well, if the doc said, are you bringing home a 6-pack or a 12-pack of pumpkin pie every night or every weekend? That's not normal. It's not normal with alcohol either. But how do we know if we don't talk about it? So that was my little tiny study, totally invalid, but it was my experience, and it made me walk away going, I can't believe this. Like, really bummed. So then I spent years trying to disprove that theory. Unfortunately, I haven't gotten there yet. So, so what does low dopamine production look like? So here's the symptoms of this disease process, okay? There's depression and fatigue, even at a very young age. A lot of people will report even at age 5 or 6, I felt isolated, a little bit detached, kind of different. I just sat in my room and I drew all day. I didn't talk to people. That's not unusual. Social anxiety, a desire to kind of hold back and isolate, even though that means you're still in a room with people, it doesn't mean you feel connected to those people. And body manipulation, smoking. I love smoking. I gave up smoking years ago, but man, that was fun. And that was because I'm sure I have low acetylcholine levels in my body, because nicotine looks like acetylcholine. So I wish when I had quit, someone had told me, you better eat food high in choline, because that will help you quit smoking, right? Like cauliflower and liver. So quitting smoking, there's actually diet things you can do, and a mild antidepressant can help with that also. And then body manipulations, what's that? So people were to start doing things like piercings, tattoos, maybe plastic surgery, and a lot of it, manipulating their bodies in different ways. And so you start seeing these people coming down the street, and they look like a drug addict. But what I see is reward deficiency syndrome. They're trying desperately to boost their excretion of dopamine, and these are ways to do it. So here's some other commonalities. Learning disorders, meaning like dyslexia, auditory dyslexia, attention deficit disorder, or ADHD is rampant in the addiction group, about over 80%. High caffeine intake, now we're talking, right? And easily distracted, completely me. There's probably a squirrel out there. Right, so those are some great symptoms of someone who does not have the right neurochemistry to help them focus and feel a general sense of well-being. So heavy menstrual periods, I don't know why. It's on a couple of lists, but I haven't been able to figure that one out. Low or high blood pressure, basically just out of normal. And that's probably because of some of the catecholamines that our body excretes and creates to help us with our blood pressure. And then a depressed libido, meaning you don't really care about sex. I guess that goes back up to the desire to isolate. So here's the little anatomy coming up. The picture on the left, I love, love, love it. It's a real picture of a real brain, and it's a way to isolate neural pathways. We have these long strands of nerves that go from our brain to our spinal cord and out to the rest of our body. They're single strands that usually they hop from one strand to the next depending on where they are in the body. There's either 3 of them or 2 of them. And when you're inside the brain, your brain impulses, or the information you just took in, follows that little pathway, the highway. And this becomes very important to how an addict thinks once they're using, okay? So I just love the picture, right? So that's the same, the guy's facing the same way as the guy on the right. So see the little dot, that's the you are here dot. I like that one. That's not true of a lot of us a lot of the time. You may not be there right now. You may not be in the prefrontal cortex. The little dot down below is the amygdala, which is in that limbic system, or the pleasure center of the brain. It's kind of like back in the dark ages. Like that's what we had when we were lizards, and it's still there. But we like to have evolved into this prefrontal cortex of higher levels of thinking. So what those areas do, there's the amygdala. Next to it is this funny little seahorse-shaped thing called the hippocampus. And above it is the prefrontal cortex. Now, you guys know there's thousands of other little things in there, right? But just for today, I just want you to get this one concept of what happens even just with drinking alcohol. So what does the amygdala do? That's your fight or flight center. So I think of it as like a baby who's being babysat. They want what they want when they want it. It's all about, can I eat it? Can I mate with it? Will it eat me? Those are kind of the things that you think. That's the amygdala. Something happens, they may talk to the babysitter, the hippocampus, which is important for memory storage and emotional regulation of emotions. And the last one that's very important, this prefrontal cortex area, which is complex decision-making, impulse control, planning, personality, and a desire to live. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever had to deal with someone who is an alcoholic or is addicted to gambling, let's say, and they do it long enough, pretty soon they're suicidal every time. It's a one-way street because they're not getting up to that part of the brain that tells you, no, you want to live. That's a good thing. You have to have access to that area of the brain, right? So let's see what else I got. Oh, child, I just got carried away here. So the parent is the one, really, that we want. That's the one we want to use all the time. Complex reasoning and, and planning, impulse control. So we're looking at somebody who's drunk and we're saying, why can't you control yourself? Well, they're down in the amygdala, and they've been there for years, okay? So addictive behaviors and substances, what happens when we're drinking, for example? I smoke a little pot. Pot's a little different, never mind. Let's say drinking. So what it does is the alcohol makes the brain kick out more dopamine. Like it releases all it's got, let it go, and then you feel pretty darn good. But we also have these funny shaped receptor sites. It's like a key and a lock system. So the dopamine goes and sticks itself into this receptor site to turn it on and make us do something. And those receptor sites are larger in alcoholics. Like if you took my brain, sliced it open, the receptor sites would be about, again, as large, so like an extra half as large as a regular brain. And the alcohol kind of fits in there and kind of mimics dopamine, kind of looks like it. So the brain's like, oh, this is great. I got so much dopamine. That's the good news. The bad news is, I got so much dopamine, tomorrow I don't need to make any. Awesome. Yeah, so then you get up the next day and say, maybe I better drink again. So what happens here when you're drinking is it stimulates brain growth, but in the pleasure center. So it's called neurogenesis. I love the word. So that becomes incredibly active in the amygdala. The amygdala, the longer you drink, especially if you started drinking when you were 12 and your brain is still growing, it's getting bigger and bigger because it likes that. It likes that dopamine. So now you're operating more with your amygdala because it's more dominant. And it thinks it's got the answers for all kinds of stuff. So it fails to even go into the memory area or up to the higher levels of thinking. So the earlier that you start drinking, the more this amygdala grows. So you're creating your monster. And I didn't start drinking till I was 22. I had babies for like 5 years. And then when I was done with babies, I thought, I'm smoking, I'm drinking, this is great. By the time I was 37, they said, you're an end-stage alcoholic. Like, are you kidding? I've been to college. I've got this great family. I'm an educated woman. I would know. I don't drink in the mornings. No, but that's not what happens. So anyway, neuropruning, or cutting away of some of those pretty pathways that I showed you, that starts happening when your amygdala starts taking over. It's just like a road. Like you go to Baker and you can look out and see the Oregon Trail still. Have you guys ever done that, where you look over and you kind of still see the wagon wheels in the dirt? It's that sterile soil now, right? But there's a pathway still there to get to the prefrontal cortex, but because of lack of use, it starts to atrophy or shrivel. And so it's like a dirt road that you don't use very much. Pretty soon it gets kind of obstructed and broken down. So it's difficult to get back to the healing process where you can get into that upper part of your brain. So I also put decreased D2 receptor sites. So not only are these receptor sites, or the lock for the key, big and funny shape, there also are not enough of them. So drinking causes this increase of dopamine, stimulates the brain to grow. Oh, that's the same thing, isn't it? Oh, I put that thing there. Okay, so that's another one of those images that shows the pathways, which is awesome. The National Institute of Health has a lot of these images on their website now if you want to go look up some more. And from going from using to getting clean in a rehab center to doing a whole bunch of the therapies that help us reconnect those pathways back up to the frontal cortex. So it takes like major therapy, but you can repair your brain. So, I've got it down. What did I put? Who knows? I like this picture. So the amygdala, think of your favorite drug-addicted person, like your neighbor's 15-year-old girl. Like, she's tattooed head to toe, she's got the dreads sticking out, she's got all kinds of body piercings, and everything is a drama. It's all drama, right? Oh my God, the electricity bill, and I kept calling him and I told him. This is like big, long story. Do you know anybody like that? And the story goes on and on. That was me. And I would rehearse that story on the way to work. When I get to work, I'm going to tell those guys what happened with me with the power bill. Instead of going up to the higher levels of thinking, which are maybe I'd switch power companies, but you can't do that in Idaho. Never mind. So maybe cable company instead of CenturyLink. But when you're in the amygdala, it's all about the drama and not about the complex reasoning that we do have available to us, because this area is completely overgrown now. So yeah, I hate to be a judgy person and say you look like a drug addict. But a lot of people who look like drug addicts are drug addicts. But a lot of people who don't look like drug addicts are drug addicts too. So I had my drama, but in a little different way. Okay. There's one, right? Okay, all that tattooing, every time she got a tattoo, her body said, it's kind of like if you get a burn or something, your body says, increase catecholamines, which is dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. So you get a surge of that to help you run away from this injury. So every time you get a tattoo, you get something for it. Yeah, it's very addicting. How do you diagnose it? You can do blood and urine tests to check for catecholamine levels and to check for dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, norepinephrine. So you can actually test somebody's blood to see what those levels are at. We don't do it, but you can. An fMRI is a functional MRI scan, which is they're really neat. Some of those are the ones that you're looking at, where the X-ray will show you where the action is. So like if there's a bunch of oxygen being used in a certain part of your brain and you're metabolizing a bunch of sugar there, it'll light up in all these pretty colors and it shows you, well, that's kind of where you're thinking right now. Or if you show them some picture of a naked woman or something, it's going to light up in a different part of your brain. And so we can track where the action is happening in your brain. So doing an fMRI early, especially if I could wave a magic wand, I would say anyone who comes knocking on the treatment center door will get an fMRI and get a blood test, just for starters. Here's your DNA structure. Sorry, can't change that. And here's an X-ray. See where all the action is? It's all down here in that fight or flight area. PET scans, similar. Those are the ones that show like the glowing orange, red, green spots, more looking at action. Bone density studies, whole nother story. Shouldn't even put that there. DNA mapping and family history. So these are not unusual. We do this for all our patients when they come in. I ask everybody, what's your family history for this and that? And then we look at the labs and the x-rays. But with mental health patients, we don't. They come in the door and they want some morphine in the emergency room. And we're like, get them out of here. And we send them away. And of course, they're going to come back the next day or go to a different hospital. So we didn't really help them at all. We're going to give you one shot and then get out of here. And this is not what we do in our country for other illnesses. Somebody comes in with a stroke, you may be in rehab for 6 months, and we pay for that because your brain has been injured. We get somebody in here with all these injuries, and we just want them to go away because they're all Mr. and Miss Drama. We don't know how to deal with it. Depression, suicidal ideation. So anyone who has tried to kill themselves that I have talked to since I found this little area of the brain in research, I will say, do you use substances? Do you use alcohol? Do you drink? Do you smoke pot? Or, are you addicted to oxys? And most of the time, people who are suicidal say, yes, I have been on something, pain medicine or whatever. And this is a real big issue because you really have to do a whole lot of rehab to get your brain to access that I want to live section. So that means you can be really detoxing, depressed, feeling suicidal for a year, 18 months. It's not all day long, but it's there. Kind of that little nagging, like, I no desire to do any more of this. Maybe just check out. So the answer is usually to self-medicate. Dysfunctional families, drama enhances drama. So a dysfunctional, stressful childhood, we always say, blame it on the mom. I had a terrible childhood. Childhood is terrible for all of us, but the difference is in an alcoholic family, we don't have enough dopamine to cope with that stressful trauma. An alcoholic family, dopamine levels are low, memory storage is poor, cognitive reasoning and trying to figure out what just happened at age 6 doesn't really work very well. Other people who kind of have a normal brain, they have a traumatic event and almost drown in the swimming pool, and they don't go out and shoot heroin because of it. They talk about, I almost drowned when I was a kid. So stressful events are a problem for addicts because it chews up dopamine. If you got enough dopamine, you're fine. If you don't have enough dopamine, now your brain isn't going to store this whole situation and process it the way it should. What's to be done? If a patient has a stroke, we'd recommend 3 to 6 months of rehab, right? Does anybody know somebody who's had a stroke? We don't let them out of the hospital if they're still talking funny and drooling. And it's like, you can't go home like that. You can't take care of yourself right. You're not thinking clearly. We send them to a rehabilitation center. We put them through all kinds of cognitive testing, cognitive practicing. They do talk therapy. We just put them through all kinds of stuff to help enhance the healing and reaccessing those parts of the brain that have been blocked off by a stroke. So we're really good about helping a head injury or a stroke patient, and our insurance will cover it. But if it's a drug addict with a brain injury, then somehow no, we don't want to cover that. And it just, drives me crazy. So diabetes, the cardiac patients, they get special education sessions, right? They have to go see their doctor. And insurance pays for that every so many times. So we want to see you every week for a month for the diabetes, and then I'm going to send you to a class, and then I want to see you every 3 weeks. And they get their testing materials. There's a lot of help. It's not easy, but there's a lot of help, and it's paid for. Naltrexone is an opiate receptor site. Oh, we're talking about this. This was a tough one for me, this medication-assisted treatment, which is basically your methadone or Suboxone. The difference between methadone and Suboxone is Suboxone's got this opiate receptor site block. So if you're taking that, it's like an opiate. So it does make you feel better, but if you try to take more opium or go get some heroin or something, it won't work because it's got this other little ingredient in it to block that. So that one, and then the methadone. Yeah, the methadone you can get at a clinic. There's not as much accountability. There's like a line of people that get their fix and they go home with the methadone. There's no opiate receptor site medication, blockade medicine in there, so you could double up with some other street drugs. They can abuse it, snort it. Why don't I like it? Well, this is the goal. A friend of mine, her son is a heroin addict, and he's had a horrible 3 or 4 years. I hear about all the time. They just put him on some medication-assisted treatment. So he's much more like his old self. He's accessing the frontal lobe, which is personality. So he seems a lot more like himself. He's working now, and so initially it looks like, okay, this is kind of working. With the Suboxone, you have to go to a doctor, so you see a doctor every month. So that's, I think, better accountability. There's a reduction in criminal behavior, right? So if you can get it for free from the clinic, then why not? The problem is, here's my analogy. Cerebral reconfiguring is delayed, and treatment may last for 3 to 4 years. You may be on this stuff for 3 or 4 years. So it's like somebody coming in and saying, Doc, I'm addicted to cake. What should I do? The doc says, we'll get you on donuts. You'll be fine. Guess what? You quit eating cake because you got donuts. But it still affects your amygdala. Still, that opiate still makes your amygdala grow. It does not help with reconnecting to the higher levels of thinking. So it's kind of a Band-Aid. That's why I don't really like it that much. I've talked to lots of people about this. I've only met a couple of people in the last 21 years who've actually gone on to a long-term successful recovery program with the drug, with this as a beginning, because you're still affecting your brain with this drug. So I'm not a big fan of it, but I have seen some people feel at least like they're not getting arrested anymore, and that's a big deal. So basically, I just said all that. So here's some more information. These are some of the things that the Harvard School of Medicine is touting to diagnose people with an addiction problem. So let's see. Oh, I'm talking about meditation. That's why. Meditation. How does meditation help you? You guys have probably heard yoga, right? Meditation, prayer, low stress. Well, what happens is you're going from the immediate amygdala information, like, I just got divorced last year, and it goes up to the hippocampus, and like, yeah, but you know, your relationship had been over for a while. And then the next phase up here in the prefrontal cortex can be, okay, let's move on. You've got more freedom than you had before, and you know, maybe you can move on now and have a real success. So meditation allows you about 30 minutes of calming all of those massive thoughts coming in and out. And the more often that you use it to reaccess the prefrontal lobe, the wider that connection gets and the easier it gets to keep going to the prefrontal lobe. So if you took that pretty little colored picture, you'd see a lot stronger connections to the prefrontal cortex. And that's where we want to be, right? So that's meditation. There are some studies, this one at Harvard, they did an fMRI beforehand that shows where all the action's happening, and then follow up 8 weeks later after a lot of meditation, and then they see a great connection between the amygdala, hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. Now we're kind of operating in the parent area again, just from meditation. Neurogenesis means growth of new brain tissue. So now we get to be up in the front again, where we're perspective taking, empathetic, compassion. There's a little area over here for compassion in your brain. That's all gone if you're just living right in your amygdala. So there's also some neuropruning or cutting away of this area of the brain that's directly related to self-obsession, which I love that. So you're not going to be like, I have a friend who says, I may not be much, but I'm all I think about. So meditation kind of helps you to get away from that area of the brain where you're completely obsessed on yourself. Are you happy? Are you fed? Are you loved? Are you me? It is possible to kind of get away from that area of the brain and restructure it towards the prefrontal cortex. So inpatient rehab, 90 days at minimum to me it's like bare minimum. And I look at the stroke patients I've sent to rehab many, many times. They get more than 90 days. So a minimum of 90 days, pause, post-acute withdrawal symptoms. What's interesting about just even alcohol is that, remember I said alcohol will pop into those receptor sites? Well, they kind of get gummed up in there. And then over time, after you stop drinking, your brain will release those molecules in those receptor sites. So at 30 days sober, you get kind of a little flush of all of this alcohol. And then at 60, in your brain. At 60 days clean, another release of some more of this stuff. And at 90 days, another release of more. As it's being released in your brain, there's an overwhelming urge to drink, because now you've got it in your system. It's triggering your brain to go get some more. And then the detoxing times go on with just alcohol, 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years with just releasing and cleaning up all the alcohol in the brain, which to me is just stunning. You know, some things we get over faster than others. Pot takes a long time because that's a sticky honey kind of substance, and that's a mess. Okay, so anyway, we provide a low-stress environment, right? We're going to do some meditation, maybe a mild antidepressant. All of this stuff is going to help the brain to heal and grow in the places that we want it to heal again. We like that. Meditation training enlarges the hippocampus, which is also about impulse or emotional control. Like how you ever known somebody who's an alcoholic and they're like crazy? I mean, they like laugh at stuff that like bad stuff, and then they cry when you're thinking, what? You just won the lottery. What's wrong with you? So meditation can help with that area of the brain that helps you to regulate your emotions. Cognitive therapy. This basically is like talk therapy. Like someone says, you need to go see a therapist. Well, there's a whole other thing going on with a therapist, and that's pulling out information out of 20 different memory centers, taking a look at it, getting a better idea of what really happened, and putting it back into maybe a little less traumatic area in your brain. That's really worth the money, I can tell you that. So cognitive therapy, a mild antidepressant, complete abstinence, and meditation. Physical exercise is great. That helps. Proper diet. All of this is what happens when a person starts into that recovery process. And yes, it's very expensive. But in my opinion, it should be covered at all times, just like any other disease process. So it's best when it's followed up. Long-term treatment, outpatient therapy can be very successful. It doesn't mean you have to go lock yourself in a treatment center for 90 days. I think it's good if you can. If you can't, some people will go to outpatient therapy like 5 days a week. Like every day they got to go, you know. And the upside is they make it through the day without getting high or drinking because they just had a bunch of therapy and reminded themselves they're not going to use today. Right? 12-step programs, why do those work? Hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people are doing 12-step programs, which is a grassroots thing, right? It started with a couple of guys in the 30s. Who said, let's secretly get together, don't tell anybody we have an alcohol problem, and help each other stop using. So it was a big secret back in the 30s. It's still a secret. So I teach in a nursing program. I have my students all go to a 12-step meeting. They freak out. They're like, you can go to the 12-step NA one or AA, either one, it doesn't matter to me, but I want you to go in, get your little paper signed after the meeting, go write a reflection paper, and you should read some of those reflection papers. They like sit out in the parking lot until it gets dark, hoping that no one sees them because, oh my God, they might think I'm actually a patient. It's just amazing, you know, that we can have a disease process going on. It's so prevalent in our society, and it's so shameful. So 12-step programs work because of cultural support, because all this talk therapy around the circle, it really helps your brain to restructure. We go from problem to solution in sharing. So someone might say, my life hit the bottom when I got arrested, and my lawyer tried to tell me to go to rehab. But then I did go to rehab, and I kept going, and I went to these meetings every day, and I've been meditating, and now I'm eating right. So they go from problems to solution, problem, solution, problem, solution. Every person that talks, and you hear that, and your brain goes from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. Amygdala, prefrontal cortex, with problem, solution, problem, solution. And eventually, if you go to those meetings 2 or 3 times a day, your brain is really starting to restructure itself in a way that's good. It's good for you. And you have a whole new group of friends. Journaling is a lot of writing, the step writing and the journaling writing, a lot of that helps to enhance the hippocampus, which is that center part, the babysitter part. Very helpful in getting that emotional regulation again. Where I think we're headed, I hope that we're headed into extended rehab 60 to 90 days directly from an emergency room or directly from a medical floor at a hospital. We take care of alcoholic patients all day long in the hospitals that I go into. And then we don't even talk to them about it. We don't tell them they're alcoholics, and we don't tell them that they need some treatment, and maybe we could send them to a rehab from here. We don't talk about it. I do now. My students do now, but it's not common. Insurance coverage, hopefully, which is similar to what we will pay for a stroke. fMRI exams weekly during the treatment phase, mostly for the patient to say, look, this is what your brain looked like last week, but look what it looks like this week. You're making progress, you know. DNA testing, that's just another like nail in the coffin, like, okay, here you go. See, this is your DNA stuff. Yeah, 77% chance we're right. Serum dopamine and serotonin levels. And then there's this weird pill in the People's Republic of China. I lived in China for a couple of years, so I'm always kind of tracking their medicine. They've got this weird study going on with this weird holistic, I think it's like ground up seafood stuff. I don't know what it is, but they're having some luck with when they're taking their fMRIs with restructuring. So, and then psychotherapy, antidepressant therapy, I do believe in that to a minor degree. I also think that we have a lot of overdiagnosis of bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder. Everybody's crazy when they're using drugs. So stop using the drugs, give it about 18 months, take a nice mild antidepressant, do all of this stuff to start getting better, and then let's see if you've got a mental illness. Because that's still a reality for some people. But everybody who's using drugs is kind of crazy, right? Okay, so here is just an example of a pretty picture. This is really like a PET scan, so it shows where the action is happening. That's a normal brain, upper left. Then this is the brain of a cocaine user. We got the brain of an obese person. I like that one. And then the brain of an alcoholic. And we would like to have those brains all look like the one in the upper left-hand side. And it can look like that. So I think that's all I have. Oh, I didn't even put a like that's all, folks. Anticlimactic. I can't think of anything else I wanted to say. Do you guys have any questions? Like how to increase your dopamine levels naturally? Of course, the good, healthy diet and exercise are the two that we all hear about for everything, and that's just a reality. Getting dark leafy vegetables, doing the meditation, doing the journaling, going to talk therapy, cognitive therapy, all of those things will help enhance dopamine production. Singing, hugs, compliments. You guys look fantastic today. Really, you do look good. And now you've gotten a little bit of dopamine from me because your brain goes, oh, thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Okay, so any questions about the brain? And yes?
How do supplements enter into this situation?
Supplements, you're talking vitamin supplements. And I think that would just be such a huge thing to look into. I have not done much with that, mostly because it would depend on the quality of the supplements, I would think. If you can, juicing raw vegetables and drinking that juice, there's just nothing better than that. It does take some time. Oh, one more thing and then I'll close. 200 years ago in our society, we believed that breast cancer was caused from cheating on your husband. Did you know that? It meant you were unfaithful. And if you hadn't cheated on him, you were thinking about cheating on him. That's why you got breast cancer. So those women were stuck in a closet. Nobody talked to them. It was their fault because they cheated on their husbands. So here we are 200 years later, and we just think, how horrible, to think like that about that disease process. But the science had to catch up with society. And that's where we're at right now with drug addiction in the brain. Science is catching up with society, but only because we keep talking about it. And hopefully someday people will say, man, that's a disease process, and you need to go see a doctor and get some help for that. Yeah, so and maybe someday we'll have parades for addiction, and instead of Save the Tatas, we'll be saving the prefrontal cortex or something. I don't know, but yeah, we'll come up with something. But anyway, thank you so much. You guys have been a great audience. Good to see you.